Afternoon, everyone.
There we go.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Graybill, and I'm with Georgia State University, and I want to welcome you to Georgia's first annual Restorative Practices in Schools Conference. This conference is being put on by the volunteers from the organizations that you see listed on your screen. The volunteers and their headshots are also on the screen. So together, First District RESA, Georgia Appleseed, the Georgia Department of Education, Georgia State University, the Intercultural Development Research Association, and Metro West GLRS came together to organize this conference because we know that our students and our educators really thrive in environments in which there are strong, positive relationships between students and between adults and students. We also know that schools have not been as welcoming, safe, or fair for our Black and Brown students to thrive in due to structural bias that has defined our discipline systems. And we need to rebuild our discipline systems to ensure that all students have access to a safe, welcoming, and anti-racist school environment. So over the next 2 days, we hope that you will hear stories about students who are able to reconnect with their schools and that you will hear strategies for changing discipline practices and policies. We also hope that you'll be inspired to either bring those strategies back to your schools and students or share your stories about the impactful restorative practices work you're doing in your schools with your fellow educators at next year's conference. So kicking off our inspirational conference is a panel that will describe how restorative practices have been implemented in Bibb County School District through a school justice partnership. And presenting today are Judge Steve Teske, the Chief Judge of Juvenile Court of Clayton County, Mr. Jamie Cassidy, Assistant Superintendent of Student Affairs for Bibb County School District, and Mr. Stephen Jones, Principal of Northeast High School in Bibb County School District. So it's my honor to turn over the microphone and the screen to Judge Teske to share his work in the area of restorative practices in schools.
Thank you, Dr. Graybill. So I'm just going to, what we decided to do is begin at 35,000 feet. So I'm going to be piloting this aircraft at 35,000 feet. Jamie's going to take it down to, I think he said about 20,000. And then Steve is going to land this airplane. So my role in this is just to give the introduction, just describe what the school justice partnership model is. And you have on the screen right now what would be the textbook definition of it. But essentially, just like the title, it is a group of stakeholders. So this is about collective decision making. And primarily it's going to be the school system, law enforcement, and the juvenile court who are the driving voting members of the committee. Others typically are advisory members, mental health, social services, and so forth. And so with that, we meet periodically. We gather data on discipline as well as involving race and gender and so forth. And we use this interbranch agreement because during the period of working together in the beginning, what we did is that we decided the terms of the agreement, what type of delinquent acts, for example, we are no longer going to send to the juvenile court. And so in lieu of arresting kids and filing on kids in juvenile court, we replaced those arrests with evidence-based practices. Primarily, we're looking at restorative practices and other educational practices and tools, and sometimes clinical responses if needed. Next slide. Now, why did we do this? Okay, take a look at this graph. Now, you will see in the beginning there, when you begin to see the increase in filings with the juvenile court, that's when we put school resource officers in schools. Basically, they're certified peace officers, they're police officers. And for us back then, it was the Clayton County Police Department. And so once we put them on campus, the number of arrests dramatically increased. I mean, what you're looking at here is the red line represents misdemeanors. Notice that the bottom line down there, those are felonies. They didn't really change much, okay? But those would be the more public safety concerns, right? But yet, look what we were doing. 92% of all these referrals were low-level misdemeanor offenses, typically disorderly conduct, simple assault, a simple battery, basically school fights, okay? And we were criminalizing these kids, all right? Now, what you see the dramatic decline is when we introduced the school justice partnership and introduced restorative practices instead, okay? Next slide. Okay, so what is it, you know, in a nutshell? Well, it's like I said, it's an MOU. It creates a partnership. Now we have a toolkit, and we use this toolkit to help us make certain decisions about how we're going to process, you know, when kids get in trouble at school. So we use what's called a focus act decision tree. The focus acts are those delinquent acts for which the agreement focuses on them as we are no longer going to refer them to the juvenile court. We've replaced those arrests with a graduated response program. That is where you include restorative practices and a number of other things. It's guided by a role conflict avoidance model. That, in other words, where the police and school administrators should not meet, okay, and where they're allowed to meet. Using a positive student engagement model for school policing, where the police are now going to be engaging the kids in a very interactive, positive way, because if they're no longer making as many arrests as they were making, all right, now they're going to be talking to the kids, going into the lunchroom, sitting down with the kids. And so next slide. Now, you know, another part of the why that Jamie and particularly Steve are going to get into is that something my father taught me. He retired from CDC. He was in infectious diseases. And he once told me back in 2002, he said, son, the problem with you folks in criminal justice is that you punish the symptoms and you don't treat the causes. And he explained to me the two basic epidemiological facts. Diseases don't occur by chance, all right, and they're not randomly distributed. Now, he told me, he said, now, son, I don't want you to confuse disruptive behaviors and diseases, because they're not. But he said they behave like diseases. Disruptive behaviors do not occur by chance, and they're not randomly distributed, which means they can be studied. And if they can be studied, you can come up with treatment modalities, hence restorative practices. Next slide. So what are the outcomes before I turn it over to Jamie? Okay, graduation rates. I mean, who would ever think keeping kids in school would increase graduation rates, right? Okay, so what you see here as the filings went down, okay, the darker brown ones are your school filings. The lighter brown ones represent the crime rates in the county by kids. Now, the black line above shows an increase in graduation rates, except for the year that they changed the graduation formula, okay, where they went from overall to the adjusted four-year cohorts. But it doesn't matter. The red line shows we still increase, regardless of the formula, even to this day, this past year. Every single year there's been an increase. Next slide. A study has been done. We had researchers come in and they found, using regression analysis, that by 95% confidence level, that the reduction in school arrests and suspensions cause a increase in graduation rates, but it doesn't stop there. The increase in graduation rates, okay, resulted in a decrease in juvenile crime, right? Because how go graduation rates, so go juvenile crime rates. The more kids that graduate, the fewer kids committing crimes, all right? So we've experienced an 82% decline in arrest in the community of crimes committed by juveniles. Next slide. But more important is this, the felonies. Kids are neurologically wired to do stupid things. Their brain is still developing, the frontal lobe cortex, right? But it's the felonies we want to look at. A decline by 64%. We're talking about the burglaries, the car thefts, the weapons charges, aggravated assaults are all, they're down. They're all down in Clayton County, all because we focus on positive engagement of the kids using restorative practices. Next slide. And Dr. Graybill spoke about racial disparities. Look at this. That black line represents the number of black students no longer being arrested. Okay. In the year that it peaked, you see there, a black student was 12 times more likely to be arrested on campus than a white student. Today, that's not so. It's not 2 times more, 3 times more. We've eliminated that. Okay, next slide. And so as I turn it over to Jamie, I said it was studied. James Howe, Mark Lipsey, John Wilson, very renowned researchers in community corrections. The School Justice Partnership is featured in this 2014 publication. I will end my segment as I turn it over to them so they can fly this thing down and land it, is that the School Justice Partnership model has been replicated in multiple jurisdictions in 41 states. But when Dr. Graybill came to me and asked me, if I could find someone, who's doing it, I immediately thought of Jamie, Steve, and Macon Bibb Schools, because what they have done with it has been unbelievable. They've taken it and done more to it, and I just feel it's important that they be featured. Jamie, I'm handing it over to you.
All right, thanks, Steve. And again, my name's Jamie Cassidy. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Student Affairs. And for us, it just started with a shift in the way we were thinking, and it had to start up at the top. We're a minority school district in high poverty. Because of poverty and other factors that go along with poverty, we have a lot of students who suffer from trauma. We were doing some good things to help address this and change our culture with PBIS and Leader in Me. But what were we doing for those students who were our multiple offenders or those with chronic behaviors other than suspending them? And in some cases, we would suspend and even file charges. And, at the end of the day or week or month, those students are coming back to us. So for us, the struggle was, how do we address the root causes to these behaviors? And it began, the paradigm shift for us began back in 1718, where we had a symposium, and we have those every summer where the principals and assistant principals come together. And we were able to do a session, and I believe at the time we titled it Emotional Poverty. Because we needed for our leaders, our principals, our assistant principals, our directors, to have an understanding of how the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system works and what happens when the amygdala gets hijacked. You see, this was very critical when trying to understand why some kids do what they do and what we as educators can do to not escalate the problem. In addition to that, we are also doing some mindset training. There's a de-escalation piece with that as well. So for us, just becoming informed was not good enough. So what we really wanted to do was dive into the question of how can we build better relationships? The School Justice Partnership, as well as Restorative Practice, has allowed us to do just that, not only with our students, but also with community members. More importantly, together, we make you understand just how important we as educators need to look at things through an empathetic lens. So as Judge Teske talked about our School Justice Partnership, and Judge, feel free to chime in here whenever you want. It started for us the spring of 2018. We took a group of stakeholders up to Clayton County and visited with Judge Teske and his team. We brought that back to our district in May and met with our local stakeholders. Then in July, and decided that this was something that we wanted to do, that we wanted to implement. In July, Judge Teske and his team came down and assisted us with the implementation. And probably one of the best pieces of material that he gave us was a template. And it was a template saying, this is what you have to do, this is how you have to do it. But it gave us the autonomy based off of our needs to be able to implement it in the way that we thought could bring us the most success. We then hired a school justice project manager in late August. We met with all the principals and the SROs to get feedbacks feedback. And one of the biggest pieces that we had to do was develop or come up with what our focus acts were going to be. And so we also partnered with agencies to provide services as well. That was an important piece, because as we refer these students, we were going to need groups that were going to be able to provide the services. So when developing our partnership, these are the goals that we established. We know each suspension, encounter with the law, or incarceration, decreases the chances of students graduating. So our goal is to keep students in school and improve the health of our community. So those are the 4 goals that we established or came up with. I spoke to you earlier, I mentioned about the focus acts, and these were the focus acts that we came up with that we were going to focus on: affray, theft, simple battery, simple assault, possession of marijuana, possession of alcohol, obstruction, disruption of a public school, disorderly conduct, and criminal trespass. So not only did we deal at these at the school level, but in our past, we had also usually attached a criminal charge, which the student wound up having to go through the judicial system as well. So just to give you some data, this was our first year of implementation. This was actually in 18-19, and as you know, our second year, COVID hit us. So that's why I chose to show you these statistics. There was 217 total notices were issued. 97 of those were written warnings, with 120 resulting in a referral for services through our partnership. So as leaders, how many times have you known that a kid has problems or issues beyond what you were able to help them with? You knew they needed some type of therapy or counseling, but you also knew that all you could do is suggest it. And that's one thing the partnership gave us. It gave us some teeth into these students getting the services that they needed. And probably the biggest piece was that the courts assisted us with holding not only the students accountable, but also the parents accountable for getting these services. And let's see, next slide. These are our number of notices by offense. You can see there affray sitting down at the bottom with 85 offenses. Next was disorderly conduct, as well as possession of marijuana and simple battery. So those were our number of notices by offense. We also broke that down to grade level, with grades 6 through 9. Of course, those were our highest grades, or our highest level of offenses per grade. When we rolled out the restorative practice piece, that was a part of our school justice partnership, we began with just one high school and one middle. Truthfully, we just didn't want to overwhelm ourselves. And this was strategically rolled out into an area that had high need, as well as with, I knew that the principals would champion this process. So we rolled it out at Northeast High School, which you'll hear from the principal of that high school next, as well as Ballard Hudson Middle School. Currently, we are training 7 schools this year, 4 high and 3 middle, as well as all of our counselors. We also trained our in-school suspension teachers in that first year, with looking at training 27 schools next year, with 21 elementary, 2 high, 2 middle, as well as our 2 programs. So that's where we currently are with restorative practice. When we look at the restorative conference process, we look at it through the lens of the 6 R's: relationship, respect, responsibility, repair, reintegration, as well as reflective practices. Not going to get into this because I think Steve's going to talk a little bit about this on the next go around. We talk about restorative practice. That's just the proactive side, as well as restorative justice, which is the reactive side. Steve, he's not big on PowerPoints. He kind of has the gift of gab. So when he starts talking, he may run over time, but I chose to give him a couple of visuals up here anyway. This is the first year that he implemented it back in 1819. You can see his incidents went down from 1,100 down to 300. His ISS days went down from 700 to 330, as well as his OSS days went from 933 to 337. So when we talk about kids, when we talk about graduation, at the end of the day, it's about those kids being in the seat in front of those teachers. And if they're in ISS or if they're suspended, that's not happening. And then this is Steve's graduation rate here. In 2015 to currently 2020, he took it from a 70% graduation rate up into the 80s in 2017, where he has remained there. And what I would tell you about this graph, if you knew all the high schools in Bibb, and if you knew what their demographics were, and if I gave you, and we have 6 high schools, and if I gave you 6 graduation rates, and you tried to match graduation rates with the demographics, you would probably not have been able to do this. So Steve has done an outstanding job for us. He champions restorative practice, restorative justice. He understands what happens with kids mentally and what they go through with trauma. He is in a very, very high need school and has done an outstanding job. And so at this time, Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Cassidy. First of all, it's definitely indeed an honor to work alongside with Judge Teske and under our superintendent, Mr. Cassidy. I think first it has to be, in order for this to work, you have to have supervisors in place that believe in it. So now let me tell you a little who we are. I'm Steve Jones from Northeast High School. Now, one of the things that you will often hear us say, our mantra is hashtag Eastside Out Loud. The reason we developed hashtag Eastside Out Loud is because there were so many negative things that were associated with our school and the East Macon community. There were so many negative things, and at one point, a lot of people did not want to send their child to school on the East Side. Even within our community, there were negative things being stated. So what we started to do was say hashtag Eastside Out Loud to talk about the positive things that are occurring. Deficit speech is a result of deficit thinking. That's what Principal Cafelli taught, teachers in his teachings. Deficit speech is a result of deficit thinking. So when we think that things can't happen, then they won't happen. But restorative practices, wow. I'll give you a personal reflection. When I first arrived at Northeast, I arrived as a turnaround principal. To be a turnaround principal, you have to have turnaround staff. You have to have turnaround assistant principals, turnaround teachers. Everyone has to have the mindset of being a turnaround employee. And the students also have to have that mentality. But let me tell you about a mistake I made. Part of me turning it around said, if you throw a bow, you got to go. If you throw a blow, you got to go. 10 days out the door. And so we were suspending kids for 10 days if you fought, because we were trying to gain order, and we felt that would be the way. But what we realized at that moment is that as you send those kids out for 10 days, they're going out and nothing is changing. So if you want to take anything away from today's session, change lives before lives change. I'm going to say it again. Change lives before lives change. And what does that mean? That means that as students were coming in, we needed to work proactively to change the heart and the minds of kids so that they would not make life-changing outcomes or make life-changing decisions that would impair them and hinder them for the rest of their lives. So we started changing lives before lives change. So now let me tell you what restorative practices is not. It is not a be all and end all. It is not a cure all pill. But what it is definitely a catalyst to decrease life-changing outcomes. Remember, change lives before lives change. Now, I want to, Mr. Cassidy talked about this earlier. Restorative practices is reactive and proactive. I need you to understand that. It's a reactive approach and a proactive approach. And you have to work with both of them. Proactively, we have at our school what's called rate advisement. This is our advisement time where we did a draft, we completed a draft, and we allowed teachers, educators, adults to pick the students that they wanted in their advisement classes until all students were full. Students that we thought we had the best rapport with. So what we did when we did that, we developed an ear. We call it keep our ear to the ground. What is it that we're going to do to keep our ear to the ground in the streets, in the community, so that we'll know what's going on? We needed to create an atmosphere where students will be willing to come back and tell us about things going on. Now that we have that in place, when students come to the school to tell us about events that are happening in the community, because our ears are on the ground now, we have an opportunity to proactively sit down and have what we call restorative circles. We have restorative circles. Now, remember, when you talk about restorative practices are built to reduce, prevent, and improve harmful behavior. It's also intended to repair and restore positive relationships, because a lot of things that happen, at one point, kids were okay with each other, but then something happened where the relationship became damaged. So we want to repair and restore. And then we also want to resolve conflicts. So proactively, we're meeting with kids in small groups to stop and prevent things from occurring that may possibly change the outcome of a student's life. Now, on the proactive side, there are things that's going to happen. There are things that's going to get by us. And that's just life. There are things that's going to happen. But at the point that they happen, we can't just suspend for 10 days and send them out and bring them back with the same heart. When they come back proactively, we bring kids back to meet in those restorative circles to talk about what happened. And one of the biggest things with restorative practices is that the reflection piece. Mr. Cassidy showed you the 6 R's, and the last R talked about reflection. Reflective practices. 9 times out of 10, kids that are experiencing this type of trauma, wearing these invisible backpacks with so much trauma going on, never take the opportunity to reflect on the impact that it makes on themselves and others. Reflection. And you have to develop a time for students to reflect on their actions. When they reflect on their actions early, hopefully it puts them on another path than just down to a negative, harmful path. So when we think about this, I'm going to get into our experience. When we first started restorative practice, a big shout out goes out to Mr. Charles Flowers. His company is Second Chance Works. Big shout out to them. He trained 6 of us. He trained myself, 2 APs. He trained, and we have 2 student engagement facilitators that work this process, Mr. McCrary and Coach Mays. And they work this process. When we went through the training, and I want to tell you this, if you're leading your building, leaders, you have to lead and you have to model. We learned the process, and it was kind of iffy. Is this really going to work? And what I decided to do was to model and lead by example. I pulled my first circle, and it just so happened that Judge Teske came down and some other people were coming, and that session dealt with someone one of our former students who had been murdered. There was a lot centered around. I mean, we lost a lot during that particular time period. And a little girl wore a shirt to school. It caused a real big rise up in the school in addition to what was already going on. And I said, you know what, this could be my first circle. Even my close team looked at me and said, are you sure you want to do this in front of somebody? This topic? I said, if we go do restorative practices, and if it's going to work, then it has to work for this. So I led the way. And of course I was a little nervous, but I knew we had to do something differently. I could no longer just talk and then send kids back out in harm's way. I knew I couldn't just suspend you and send you back out of harm's way. I had to do something different. I couldn't be insane and keep doing the same things over and over. So we sat down, we worked, and by the time we finished, and those students went through the restorative practices that Dr. Flowers had taught us, and those different things like that, those students left out on a different note. But here's the kicker. Those students never got into it again. That was something new. Those students did not go back out. It didn't erupt in the community again. Those students never had what we call beef again with each other. Now let's bring it on even closer. Just about 2 weeks ago, a similar situation about another child who was murdered. See, we're still having things. Y'all, it's so much going on in our community. School has to be the safe place. We have to make school the safe place. So just a few weeks ago, I started seeing things rising up in the building with the school breaking out into two different things. And that was part of my talk. We had a restorative circle where we met with 13 people. It was 13 people in this circle, but we went through the process because we needed to be proactive before something dangerous and very serious ended up happening to more students. So at that particular time, we met and it started off a little soft, but before we left out, everyone understood where they stood. They understood the impact that it made. Now, let me tell you why this was different, because usually in a restorative circle, you have your parents to come in as well as the students. But because it was 13 and because our parents at this particular point, because our parents in the community were at odds with each other and also added with each other, I said, you know what, let's just meet with the students right now. We met with those students. Students have been walking in their own paths now, doing what they need to do. But it was because we took the time, we took the courage to pull all of those students in, to meet with them and to talk and to implement these practices. And as a result, we have not had another issue. Those students now are walking around. Some students had opted to stop even coming to school because of that. Now students want to come back to school. Students are walking around not really bothering each other. They're getting their lesson more now, but it was because we went through the process of those restorative practices. And so again, what I want to take away is the reflecting piece. If we don't take the time as educators to teach students how to reflect, when will they get it? Some students may get it at home, but what about the ones that don't get it at home? When will they ever learn that life-changing skill of personal reflection and impact of your actions on someone else? So remember, we change lives before lives change. And that's just a little snippet from us at Northeast High School.
Well, and Steve, I would like to jump in here and put a little bit more context on your first peace circle, the one where I met you for the first time. Okay.
Yes, sir.
And I want the audience to know that how this came to be, that is, how did I end up in your school, was about 2 or 3 days earlier that week. I was in a meeting. We had 2 auditors from Washington, D.C. So just so the audience understands, there's the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act. States who participate in that, which most do, they receive federal funding if they comply with the 4 core protections. And every state has to have an entity or agency that's created that provides oversight of that funding and makes decisions about who gets funding throughout the state. Well, I'm the most, and the governor appoints all of those. And so I'm one of the board members, and I'm the most senior board member. And so we get audited every 3 years by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. On the first day of the week, the auditors come in, we all sit down, we go over the agenda, which we had to submit in advance. But this time, the auditors said, you know, we would really like to see a school that has school resource officers. Okay. And, you know, that's like, oh, okay, well, I wish we had known that. Well, I left the room. I called the district attorney there in Bibb County, who called the school superintendent, who called Jamie Cassidy. Jamie gets back with me. Within no time, he has it set up for Thursday, okay? And it's just so happened, coincidentally, that the day that we come is the day that Steve feels this this need to go ahead and do the peace circle. Here's the rest of this context, okay? Those two auditors, okay, from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, whose administrator is appointed by the President of the United States, left there in tears. Because you also have to visualize what happened where these three boys had attacked this girl. They actually physically assaulted her by pulling on her shirt and that, okay? But the way Steve handled it with a beanbag, throwing the beanbag to each one, letting them talk, and how he worked it, okay, was so strategic that when he asked one of the boys through the beanbag, he said, well, now that you know this information from this young lady, what are you going to do with it? And he says, I'm going to tell everyone the truth. I'm going to tell everyone the truth. And not only that, but when it was all over with, one of the boys said, is it okay if I hug you, looking at the girl? And they ended up in a group hug. Tears start to flow. Well, I go to Washington, D.C. often, okay? I had made 2 more visits to Washington, D.C. before COVID hit. And the administrator of OJJDP both times said, my auditors are still talking about that day at that high school in Bibb County. Think about it, ladies and gentlemen, what's going on in his school. Had he not done that, those kids would not only still have a beef, but it would cause further disruption in that school. And that school is safer because of this, and its school climate improves because of it. Now you understand why I have these 2 gentlemen with me speaking today. All right.
So, Steve, can you talk about how you implemented, or how you implemented restorative practices, so that it's just not thought of as being just another initiative?
Yes, well, we have basically what we have is in Bibb County, we have Leader in Me, where we're teaching the 7 habits to our students. We have PBIS, where we're rewarding students. But you also have to have in place a tool. This is a tool. We talk about our toolboxes as educators. We have to have a tool for dealing with conflict. The PBIS rewards, and we're using all of them. Some people may say, well, we got all these different initiatives. We can't do this, but they all work together. It's a cycle. You have to have a toolbox. So we're using the Leader in Me to build that internal understanding of just good, solid habits. We use PBIS again as a mechanism for rewarding high school students and allow them to see that they're building extrinsic opportunities using PBIS. But then to deal with the conflict, we wanted a tool and a resource to deal with that, because a lot of times, we think that, if you talk to somebody, then they'll leave out and it's different. So what we decided to do was to really study it. And I had our ISS teacher. We created 2 positions. Under the SIG grant, we created what's called student engagement facilitators. Now, the reason we created those positions was because in ISS, when students acted abruptly or out in school, what happens? If they get in trouble in first period in science, they usually get sent to ISS for 3, 5, or 10 days. They have missed 3 days out of a teacher's class who never had a problem with them. And then we wonder why our scores are low. So what I wanted to do was I said, let me train and give our ISS teacher and our student engagement facilitators a tool and a process to use when kids come. So now, instead of putting them in ISS for 3, 5, or 10 days on a first attempt, we give them to the student engagement facilitators, and then they implement restorative practices at that particular time. And the intent is that by the end of that period, or within an hour, lives will be different and that they would change what they were doing. And in many instances, it works. And so then those children are actually able to go back out and still stay in the main flow of school. So we started off on a very narrow scale with just a small group of us. Then today is so awesome. Just this morning in our leadership team meeting, the assistant principal said, Mr. Jones, we need to get more people trained in this so that everybody's speaking the same language, because it's not just going to do us any good just for the 6 of us to have it and it works, but it needs to be a language throughout the whole school. So we're bringing Mr. Flowers back in to train our entire faculty and staff. And we also have Mr. McCrary, who's one of our SEF student engagement facilitator, who's taking on a lead role. And so beginning next year, what we're going to do is every faculty meeting for 30 minutes, we're going to have that devoted all to social emotional learning, restorative practices, and then the other hour and a half will be related to academic, because we have to do this. It is a major piece. If you don't build that rapport, then you can't teach students anyway. So that's around a scope of how we've implemented it and what we plan on doing in the future.
And so I'm sure there are also those on the line that's curious about how are you funding this?
So initially we funded it through SIG, and we were a pilot school. And after seeing it work, as Mr. Cassidy showed you, the district is now taking on ownership and leadership with it, where more schools are being trained with it. And it was worth the training, is worth us getting it in. And so now the district, as you noticed, the 27 schools will be trained in this and in threat assessments for this. And so we piloted it. Then a few more schools came on, and now the district is actually involved because they see the impact. Remember, this is about recidivism. Recidivism also occurs in school, not just in the adult prison system. Recidivism can recur in our high school or middle school. The students that are chronically offenders will chronically come back and keep reoffending. And so it is our job to stop that and to move students on into their destiny.
Yeah, and can I comment on what he just said? That's a very good point, Steve, about recidivism. One of the things that's great about a school justice partnership is that when you blend the stakeholders and they come together, we learn from each other. You know, I learned a great deal more about best practices in education, and likewise, educators learned a great deal about best practices in the juvenile justice world. And one of those things is this. The research is adamant. We've known it for many, many years. In an article I published a few years back, I titled it Hyper-Recidivism. And it goes like this. The first step in reducing crime in your community is to look at your own system and see who are you targeting the wrong way. So the low-risk kids, the kids who make you mad, not the kids who scare you. When we treat them harshly, we will turn them into the kids who scare us. We will make them worse. And that's sad when the system is set up for rehabilitation, but because we're not reading the research, we're not employing best practices, we actually do stupid things. We make the community worse ourselves. And so that's what Steve's talking about. And that's what the School Justice Partnership is about. Those focus acts that Jamie put up on the slide, you know, those, if you really think about it, those are typical adolescent behaviors, okay? And you know, as he's going to it right now, I did some of those things. Hey, when I was 13, I did something that brought the police and the fire department out. And I don't have time to get into it now, okay? But my point is, you know, we have to give kids an opportunity to grow up. We don't, I mean, how many of us here want the rest of our lives to be defined by something we did when we were 14? Okay. And that's what Steve's talking about.
Okay, thank you. And Steve Jones talked about us rolling it out, and I talked about us rolling it out next year, this upcoming year, to 27 schools. What we're going to do is we're going to have each school will identify what we are going to call a threat assessment team. That will be made up of 5 individuals, and we're going to train all 5 of those in threat assessments as well as restorative practice. So that's how we'll roll that out as a district. Obviously, we think it's important. Again, I'm going to take you back to our first slide when I put the data up there. What we were doing, it just wasn't working. We were getting some results, but we were not getting the outcomes that we thought we should be getting. So it goes back to building relationships, and I don't know where you guys are that's online as far as in the restorative practice or in the school justice partnership, where you are in that process. But it all goes back to relationships. And as you get into whether it's school justice partnership or restorative practice, you'll see how each one of those helps you build relationships. And restorative practice, it's not just something that you can use or have to use with your students. Use them as a senior cabinet. Sometimes we'll start our morning, and it used to be stand up, but with COVID, we no longer stand up. We sit in our chairs and we're virtual. But back when we were stand up, we would get in a circle. And every once in a while, it would be like, okay, to the person that's to the right of you, tell me something good about that person. So it can be something as simple as that. But again, that's on the proactive side. Where restorative justice is what you heard Steve talk a lot about is on the proactive side, and restorative justice is on the reactive side of it. So it can be used in different settings. And if you are not currently using that, I can tell you for us, all of it, we have 35 schools. All our schools are Title I, and it's something that we're going to use and keep using, just simply because of that relationship piece.
Mr. Cassidy, I think Kimberly Reed asked a question about implementing PBIS and restorative practices in. As you go through the curriculum for restorative practices, as Mr. Cassidy said, some of these skills that you learn during this particular time can be conducted at the beginning of lessons instructionally when you teach those. Our school has not moved to that phase yet. That's one of the reasons why we want to go in and train everyone, but you can actually open classes up with this. But I want to kind of talk about the PBIS. For our PBIS system, we use PBIS rewards, and it is a school-wide system where we set our incentives in place. But when you're looking at the restorative practices piece, this directly impacts the discipline part of the building, where we are either acting reactively or proactively to specific events. PBIS is general and creating a general environment. But when that after that environment has been created, again, things are going to arise. And when you arise, you have to have the tools for the specific tool for that specific event. And so that's when we pull the restorative justice and the restorative practices in to handle conflict, either proactively or reactively. So they go hand.
And Jason Byers out in the audience described it like you did when you said, PBIS is a general, and and restorative practice is a specific tool that works within that framework. And Jason Byers said it is that keep in mind PBIS is not a program. Okay, restorative practice is a tool, and so he said restorative practices are implemented within the framework at all three tiers. Establish the framework and then layer in supports. So I thought I would, we're kind of, what time do we end here? Is it at the half hour? At 12? At 1:30?
Looks like 1:30.
Yes, sir, it's 1:30.
Okay. All right. So I can get the research. Someone was asking about the research on low risk versus high risk. I will say this: if you were to Google right now, okay, or at any time, using the search terms, what works in community corrections, okay, or you could put evidence-based practices, community corrections. You can also do it by being real specific and put in Ed Latessa. He's at University of Cincinnati. He's also a renowned researcher who has done a lot of work. You can get him on YouTube on what works, And he does an excellent job of presenting this. And he talks about low risk, medium risk, high risk, and what type of practices are better suited for high risk versus low risk. Like low risk would be diversion. Okay, keep them away from the system. All right. Whereas high risk is going to be your more intensive stuff. Okay. Well, with that said, I want to bring it full circle. Within students, we have the same thing, low risk versus high risk. Okay. And when I want to tie it back in with what Steve said regarding trauma. So when we did the ACEs survey, the Adverse Childhood Experiences survey back in 2008, with our chronically disruptive kids who are being referred, not charged, okay, but are being referred, all right, for services, we found that that restorative practices were not attaching well with some of them. And the reason is because, we found that 86% of them were suffering complex trauma. I mean, they were living in poverty and all the things associated with poverty, all right? And so that's when we had to build a different system for those kids that would provide clinical responses so that things like restorative practices would attach. So even among the student, there's the high level and the low level, okay? And we want to make sure that we, even with the kids who really drive us crazy, don't give up on them. You have to reconfigure the system, and that's what's really going on here in Macon Bibb. Okay, the Clayton County school system. I love my Clayton County school system. The culture has changed there, and that's the other important thing. Nothing should be based upon a personality. It shouldn't be based on Judge Teske. It shouldn't be based on any particular school superintendent. But our role as leaders is to change the system permanently in a positive way. That is its culture, so that when I leave or anyone leaves, it doesn't go with them. It doesn't stop. We keep it because it's good for the students, and that's what's happened in Clayton County. Okay, is that the school now sustains it. Instead of being highly dependent upon the juvenile court for services for these kids, they've built them in themselves because you know what? They know it works, and that's great leadership. And maybe there's y'all given some vision, Jamie, about the rollout there and all that. But any thoughts that you have as a top administrator regarding what I just said in terms of culture?
I take it back to the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Before any learning can take place, the kids have to be in a good place for that to happen mentally. And right now, especially in what type of district you may be in, and by that I mean what all your kids may be dealing with. Pandemic's one thing, but I heard Judge Teske use the term chronic. That can be multiple layers of trauma for an extended period of time. There is what we mean by chronic trauma. And when that happens, I mentioned about the amygdala being hijacked. Kids, they may sense, their brain takes over and may sense something as being going to be fearful in their eyes, and it immediately shuts down that frontal cortex, and then they're just reacting on emotions. There is no reasoning happening or taking place. So it begins with the culture. It begins and ends with the culture.
Thank you. And Kelly Flatt, I saw your comment out there about incorporating the Why Try resilience with Christian Moore. Christian Moore and we presented together on a number of occasions. He's a dear, good friend of mine. In fact, we presented together just about a month ago. So yeah, I highly recommend him. And then Steve, when you brought up Mr. Flowers, I've known Mr. Flowers for a long time. He is great at what he does, and so I'm so glad that y'all reached out to him and brought him in. I think it's also important to let y'all know that in all these communities in these 41 states, every single one of them have produced positive outcomes. I mean, it's not only replicating the model in the way that it's best for them and their community, like Bibb did, okay, but they all have replicated similar outcomes. I mean, reduction in arrest, increase in graduation rates, and eventually after about 3 to 4 years, you begin to see a reduction in the juvenile crime rates, okay, for those that have been doing it long enough. That's what makes it an evidence-based program. That's what got this in that 2014 book, A Handbook for Evidence-Based Juvenile Justice Systems, is when you replicate it with fidelity, you're going to replicate the outcomes, okay? And I do believe, after 22 years sitting on the bench, okay, that the key to reducing juvenile crime is how we treat our kids with positive relationships. And that's why I give kudos, not only to my school system, but Bibb County. And they just took off and they ran with it. I mean, as you can see in this short period of time, what they've done. Well, there's only 4 minutes left. Is there any parting comments, Steve and Jamie?
No, I do like Jacqueline Smith-James' question about using restorative circles with attendance. I'm taking that away immediately. I'm going to use that. Thank you for that. She asked a question, but it's a suggestion because we have not, and that is a major issue virtually. So that's one of the things that I will be getting with our student engagement facilitators. And I also want to go back the question about PBIS and restorative practices. Actually, Mr. Cassidy, he's in charge of our PBIS for the district-wide as well. Dr. Flowers trained all of the PBIS coaches in restorative practices as well. I also want to bring that back up so that everybody starts getting both and hearing the language of both so that they move in that way. That's just another thing I wanted to add. And I guess my parting words are change lives before lives change to something that students don't want. We're changing those lives before lives change.
And I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Continue the work that you're doing. It's important work. And that's it, Judge Teske.
Okay, well, there gets the point where if you just keep talking for the sake of talking, then stupid things are going to come out. So I don't want to look stupid. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to turn it over to the host.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Daniel Rivera. I'm part of the IT team that's hosting this, making this stuff work in the back end. I did want to encourage you all to I wanted to encourage you all to take a look at the sheet that we have back here. You got to the live stream via this. We are making updates to it as we need to. Some schools were having some issues accessing this. You obviously are not if you're watching this. But we did want to encourage you to take a look at our mobile app. The mobile app does have a schedule and all of the sessions on there and links to the Google Meet if you'd like to do it via mobile. By the way, all of these sessions will be recorded and these Meet links will be replaced with actual video, which we have for the keynotes. So you can watch the videos right there in your mobile app if you need to do that. In addition, our website will have information updated as we proceed in the next few days. We'll have videos of all the sessions as well as resources. There's a resource tab up here that will take you to a document that will be growing over the next few days with resources from all the different sessions as the presenters put them up there. So we just bookmark this main page, this private page that you've gotten, the bit.ly link that you got in your email, and come back to this after each session to go to the links to the next thing. The last thing I want to mention is that there is a feedback form at the end of each day. There's one for day 1 and a separate one for day 2. These feedback forms are essential for you to get credit for attending. We cannot verify your attendance without you filling out these forms. So fill out the feedback form. If you try to do it now, it's going to tell you we will not open it till 3 p.m. And that means because we really want you to attend these things before you give us feedback on them. But we will open them at 3 p.m. And once you fill that out, we will then be able to credit you attendance. And within about 3 to 5 business days, you're going to get a certification of attendance for this day. If you attend both days, you need to fill out both feedback forms. So we really appreciate you all giving us that feedback. We really appreciate you all just keep coming back to this page, bookmark it if you have to. Okay, and with that, we're going to end the keynote. And the next session is at 1:45. You come back to this main page here, the bit.ly link that you got in your email, and just click on either Meet link. Now, let me tell you one thing. These are limited to 250 people per. So I don't think that will be too much of a problem. I think we have about 300 to 400 people in this conference today. But if one of them is full, just jump into the next one or find a secondary choice for yourself. That should not be a problem tomorrow, as we have 8 sessions to split up amongst all the attendees. But just in case it's full, jump into the other one, and don't worry, there will be a link to view this a few days from now on YouTube. All right, thank you all very much. We're going to end the live stream, and we'll get into the next session at 1:45.